household. Melissa could see her house from several streets away, and with that sight came the dread, a feeling that pulsed within her skull. It had a sound to it, a throbbing. It crept up on her like the spire over the neighboring houses, the strange shape that had been built through her steepled roof. It had the look of an old church. She had tried to ask if that were the case many times, but she had never gotten a straight answer. She only knew that it was old and that it had been in the family for many generations. An artifact of sorts, an heirloom. She could make out its form as she made her way home from George's house. More of its old architecture. It stood apart from the other houses on her street, maybe different from the houses on any street, and it was the spire that seemed to dominate so much of the way home. It was constant, imposing, and it stood like a suggestion of bad things ahead. The more it came into view, the greater the throbbing, and the louder the strange sound, the sound of something beating away. It slowed each and every step taken, but not so much as the sight of the front door. Melissa looked at it for a few moments. She sighed and then opened it, and she stepped into her home. Her mother was waiting for her in the hallway. She had a harsh look to her, as she was thin, with pronounced corners along the joints of her arms, body, and face. Melissa avoided direct eye contact. Staring would not help with knowing that she was upset. Nor did she need to see the stress creases along her brow or the bags under her eyes to make her stand still and ready herself for the attack she knew was to come. "You are late," Melissa's mother said. Melissa nodded, still avoided eye contact, but she could feel her mother creeping closer. "I needed you here. You were supposed to be here." "I'm sorry," Melissa said. "You have things to do." "I know." "Your duties, Melissa." Melissa looked ready to say something. Her mouth quivered, but she stopped herself. She felt her mother tracing every insinuation of movement, every hint of objection. "I don't know how many times I have to say it. You need to help me." The young girl stood still and nodded her head. "Where have you been?" She thought of Georgia, her school friend, but that would not explain it, and she knew that her mother would not want to hear such an excuse. So she said nothing. She could not tell her that she had stayed at her friend's house for no other reason than having to come home. "Well, you are here now, yes?" she asked, and again gazed for objection. "Good girl. Now go. Do what you have to do." "I'll help with dinner." Melissa's mother stopped her, took her shoulder with a firm grasp. "No, Melissa. Basement first." Melissa went cold. "Perform your duty, and try not to be late again." There was a harshness in her voice, though she took hold of Melissa and embraced her. Melissa noticed neither. She was numb. All she could do was stare across the hallway that led to the door. Beyond that was the stairway. She was only vaguely aware of her mother, who headed into the kitchen. "After you are done, we can have dinner." The girl stood for a moment, hoping for some means to avoid that hallway, but she had held it off long enough. Georgia had practically demanded that she leave by the time she had, and she knew that she did not have a choice, not so long as she lived in this house. It was getting late, and she did not want to do things at night. She didn't want to be down there. She walked along the hallway and saw the door. The door was not similar to any other part of the house, where everything, even the spire which reached up above the stairway, spoke to an old, strange history. With odd and impractical architectures, the door did not look historic. It was barbaric and modern, solid steel with a large, imposing lock built into it. She took out the key and unlocked the great metal thing, pulled at the handle and drug it open. It screeched and resisted as she felt the weight of it, but she was able to pull it wide enough to fit through. She tried not to worry about it closing by itself, but she also tried to imagine herself anywhere else. The opening revealed the staircase and the darkness below. Melissa turned on the light, but it did little to help with the trip. The little globe in the entryway sputtered to life, but the light that came from it was powerless against the darkness beyond. All that it shone on was grim stone walls, and the metal door she had come from. The actual journey down was always in darkness. The staircase was a simple one, perhaps made centuries ago. Its stairs were carved out of the stone that the house stood on. There were no turns or spirals, just a steady walk downwards. Melissa had thought it 2 floors, maybe 3 deep. She did not like to think about the dimensions of it. However deep, the air was different in the basement, musty and thick. She could picture mold and mushrooms growing in the corners, but she had never felt the want to check for them. The floor was littered with things, not in the way most people's basements would be. This was not a place for junk or cast-offs, or a place to put things that were to be forgotten about. Everything down there had a purpose, and she hated it. She took up a candle holder that sat on a little table near the bottom. With it she could see past her feet. The things in the basement too, Melissa had never felt much want to look over. Things like the jars, the ones filled with fluids, some of which had things in them. Or look at the placed about stones in their strange patterns, as well as the various things that looked like candle holders or statues. There was even what she thought to be a human skull. It was enough that her mother had told her to watch her feet, that she could not disturb anything. Just do her duty. She walked past all these things and made her way to the corner. The casket was in the corner, and besides it was her family duty. She picked up the tome. The casket was old and seemed to be made out of solid rock. In its edges were symbols and images that Melissa did not understand or want to. But it was the center point, where all the rocks, the statues, the candle holders, the jars, the darkness, and the very dread of the place. The casket was where they all led to. Each thing important and placed in its strange, significant manner. She took the book, opened it, and tried to focus her eyes on the thing. The book gave her the dark feeling, more than the basement with its smell and the strange things covering every surface. Maybe more than the casket that it had always rested besides. The book moved. It opened to where she last read it. As it did, the passages seemed to shift and swerve about the page, her eyes unable to keep pace. The passage seemed to shift and swerve about the page, her eyes unable to keep pace. Whether she knew it or not, she was reading them aloud. She heard herself in a voice that wasn't hers, and then it shifted to one that was not. The voice of the book spoke in some forgotten language. It echoed once and then again, a chain of language, a chorus. Each phrase bouncing off the walls and joining into itself and circling around until it was in all the places within the room. The voice got so loud and connected to every surface that it seemed like the basement itself was speaking. It was so loud that the room seemed to shake, shifting on its very axis, as though its hinges were being jolted. There was another sound in the cacophony, a violent beating sound, of hammers, thunder beating in the distance. But it wasn't far. It was coming from within the casket itself. Melissa trembled as the sounds were too much. She tried to steady her mind, take hold of herself, but they would not stop. She dropped the book to the ground, breaking up all the noise. Melissa turned to the stairs, rushed to them in the dark of the place, the dank basement. The light was still on at the top of the stairs. It was distant, but in it she could see a figure. It was her mother standing there. She was wearing her dinner apron, which, as always, was covered in blood. It was a horrific sight, but saved by one thing. Her face was kind, concerned. "Melissa, are you okay?" she asked. Melissa's hand was rested on her cheeks as she tried to calm herself down, tried to keep herself from crying. "I tried, but the noise, Mom, it was so loud," Melissa said. I know, dear. I heard it. It's never been so loud." Melissa was patting at her cheeks, which she realized were wet, either from fear or tears. "Oh, Mom, please don't make me do it. I hate doing it." "Shh, baby, it's okay." Melissa's mother took her hands from her face and brushed her fingers through her hair. "It needs to be done. You can do it," Melissa's mother said. Melissa felt a kind of betrayal or helplessness. She bowed her head and stalked over to the casket, picked up the book from where it had fallen from her hands. The book shifted open, and again it found its place. Melissa tried to brace herself for the swirling colors and the alien voice. She felt something touch her shoulder, and noticed it was not her voice reading, and it was not that of the dark alien. There was warmth besides her. Her mother was standing over her shoulder. A soft hand took hold of hers, and for a moment she thought that it was safe, that there was nothing to be scared of. Melissa's voice joined along with her mother's, and the two of their voices were replaced by the dark things. Melissa was happy. She would get her mother's help, but she also knew that she would need to carry out the family duty, as her mother had taught her, as her mother had taught her, as had gone on for as long as the burden had existed. Their voices swelled and flowed around the room again. Again the beating from the casket began. It seemed to shake the home from its very foundations. It was loud, louder than before, but Melissa felt her mother's hand around hers,